In this video, we will hear stories from cemetery keepers, tales from those who tended the cemeteries at night and witnessed that what is hidden among the graves and shadows can follow them beyond the cemetery.
Nocturnal Lament.
I will never forget the first time I saw that woman. Her wailing echoed throughout the cemetery like a heart-wrenching lament. I work as a caretaker of an old cemetery on the outskirts of the city. My night shifts were usually quiet, with the sound of the wind between the tombstones and the occasional nocturnal animal wandering around. But that night, everything changed. I was inside the small shed I use as an office, reviewing some notes about the deceased, when I heard her for the first time. A distant sobbing, as if it came from the depths of the earth. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and went outside to see if someone needed help. As I walked among the tombstones, the sound seemed to move from side to side, and confused, I returned to my work. The following nights became increasingly unsettling. The crying returned at different hours, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it was always there. Sometimes I thought I saw a blurry figure in the shadows. Other times, I just felt a cold presence that made my skin crawl. But one of those nights, I saw her clearly. She was a few meters away from me, standing in front of an old, forgotten grave. It was a woman with long, black hair tangled over her face, dressed in a dirty white nightgown as if she had been buried in it. Her skin was so pale that it seemed to glow in the moonlight. When she turned around to look at me, her face held an expression of eternal sorrow. My legs trembled, and for a moment I was paralyzed. She extended a hand toward me, and her sobbing grew louder, more agonizing. It seemed as if she was begging for help. I took a few steps back, and when I blinked, she was gone. In the days that followed, it didn't matter which corner of the cemetery I went to. She was always there. I would see her standing next to a tombstone, then behind a tree, always crying, always looking at me, pleading for help. Each time I tried to approach her to say something, her figure would vanish, leaving only the echo of her crying. I reached a point where I couldn't bear the tension. When I went home, I could barely sleep, unable to get her image out of my head, and every nighttime sound would make me extremely nervous. I began to search through the cemetery records, looking for any woman buried there who matched the description. But there was nothing. No name, no story. It was as if she had never existed. One night, in desperation, I shouted into the air for her to stop following me, that I would help her if she told me what she needed. But all I received was silence. A silence so thick that it seemed to press against my ears. And then, once more, her crying, closer than ever. Finally, one early morning, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to leave. I couldn't bear the idea of staying there one more minute. I gathered my things and walked home before the sun rose. But the terror did not stay behind. That night, when I was already in bed, I heard the same crying I had heard in the cemetery, but this time it was coming from outside my house. I got up, my heart racing, and went to the window. I saw her there, standing on the sidewalk, looking at me with those dark, empty eyes that could barely be seen through her hair. She walked slowly toward my door, and I couldn't stop watching as she approached, while I kept repeating to myself, "Don't come in, don't come in." But somehow, she did. I left my bedroom, and as I entered the living room, I saw her advancing toward me. She was so close, too close. I could feel the cold emanating from her body and the scent of damp earth and withered flowers. I stood there, paralyzed for a few seconds, until I managed to react. I ran to the door without looking back, my heart pounding and certain that she was right on my heels. Her crying grew louder, and the sensation of her icy fingers almost touching my back never left me. I ran to a neighbor's house who took me in that night. I never went back to work at the cemetery. I moved to another neighborhood, far away from everything. But every night, I still hear the echo of her crying. And sometimes, I swear I see her standing in the corner of my room with her pleading eyes asking for help.
Laughter in the fog.
First, there were small laughs and shadows that disappeared when I looked at them, but soon she began to show herself. A girl who was always barefoot and never stopped smiling. Some time ago, I worked as a caretaker in a cemetery. My routine was simple: do a round around the perimeter, make sure everything was in order, and then return to the guardhouse until dawn. Everything was usually quiet, but one night a month ago, things were different. The weather was freezing, even though it was still autumn, and the fog covered everything like a heavy blanket. As I headed towards the old part of the cemetery, I heard something I had never heard before. A soft, childlike laugh, almost imperceptible. I stopped in my tracks and turned in all directions, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. I thought maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me from tiredness. But just as I was about to continue, the laughter came again, this time clearer, closer, as if it was right behind me. When I turned around, I saw a small figure, barely visible through the mist. A girl, wearing a white dress and barefoot, was watching me from a few meters away. Her black hair, soaked by the fog, clung to her face. I couldn't see her eyes clearly, only the smile that was drawn on her pale face. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my voice betrayed my nervousness. She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me, with that smile that seemed too wide, too out of place for a child in a cemetery. I took a few steps closer and saw how the girl remained motionless, just looking at me and smiling. I could hear the echo of laughter resonating throughout the cemetery, but this time it wasn't coming from her. It seemed to surround me, as if coming from all directions. I tried not to panic and moved towards her to help her get out of there. But as I got closer, her figure began to fade, as if the fog was swallowing her. I spent the night searching everywhere. There were no traces of the girl, and I began to wonder if I had really seen her. But then, something strange happened in my guardhouse. When I returned, near the desk, I found small marks, muddy footprints as if someone had walked barefoot. The chair, which I had left in its place, was turned around, facing the window that looked out to the cemetery. From that night on, every time I did my round, I felt her presence following me, laughing, whispering words I couldn't understand. And if I ever stayed still for too long, I could see her small silhouette in the distance, watching me from behind some gravestone. One night, while I was in my guardhouse, I saw her sitting on the floor, as if waiting for something. Her face was partially covered by her hair, but her smile was visible. The worst part was when she spoke. Her voice was soft, like a whisper. "Do you want to play with me?" she said. I froze, feeling the unbearable cold in the room. The guardhouse, which had once been my refuge, now felt like a trap. Every dark corner seemed to be hiding something. I gathered my courage and turned on the flashlight. The light cut through the darkness, and for an instant, her entire face was exposed. Her eyes were two empty sockets, black as the night itself. But that wasn't what terrified me the most. The smile was still there, but it wasn't human. It was a grotesque grin, too wide, stretching from ear to ear. When the light touched her, she vanished, leaving only the echo of her laughter behind. I ran out of the guardhouse, not caring about anything else. I ran to the other end of the cemetery, but her presence was still there. I could feel her breathing behind me, with laughter wrapping around me. Finally, I stopped at the entrance gate and crossed out of the cemetery. For a moment, everything went silent. I thought I had escaped. The next day, I tried to quit my job, but they told me they needed a replacement and that I had to stay a few more days. I had no choice and spent those days locked inside my guardhouse. I didn't see the girl again, but on the last night, I heard her laughter again, this time softer, more distant. I thought that maybe finally she would leave me alone. I left that cemetery months ago, but every night, when I am alone and the silence is total, I can still hear that soft, childish laugh calling to me from some dark corner of my house.
The man with the flowers.
I have never believed in ghosts, but when I saw that man standing still, whispering in front of the tomb, I knew that something was terribly wrong in that place. I have been working as a cemetery guard for a few years now. Recently, I moved and started working in an old cemetery that had been in operation for over 200 years. It was large, with everything from niches to mausoleums. It looked like something out of a movie. The job was simple: keep the graves clean, remove the withered flowers, and make sure everything was in order at closing time. I had only been working there for a week when I noticed that, on one of the graves, withered flowers appeared every morning, even though at the start of my night shift, I had already removed them. Curious, I approached the tomb. The name was barely legible due to the worn-out headstone. I could make out that a woman had been buried there more than 100 years ago. I took the flowers away, thinking it was some kind of prank by the town's teenagers, but the next day, they were back in the same place. This repeated itself for several nights. One night, I decided to keep watch. I hid behind one of the marble statues, waiting for hours. It was past midnight when I saw him. A man, dressed in an old-fashioned black suit, was walking slowly among the graves with a bouquet of flowers in his hands. He walked with a slowness that seemed impossible to me. His face was pale and empty, as if he were lost in another world. I thought he was someone who had snuck into the cemetery, so I approached him, trying to speak to him. But as soon as he placed the flowers on the grave, he lifted his gaze towards me. His eyes were deep, dark, and seemed endless. He stood there staring at me as if he had known all along that I was there, and then he simply vanished. From that night on, my life turned into a nightmare. When I returned home, I felt like someone was following me. Even inside my own room, the temperature would suddenly drop, and I could hear whispers that seemed to come from everywhere. When I lay down to sleep, I could hear the creaking of footsteps approaching my bed, and if I dared to turn around, there was nothing there. But one early morning, I finally saw him, standing in the corner of my room. It was him, the man with the flowers, motionless and staring at me. I didn't sleep that night, and at dawn, although the figure had disappeared, the feeling of his presence remained stuck in me like a thorn. In the cemetery, things only got worse. Every time I tried to remove the withered flowers, a cold breeze would run through my body. At first, the chill was only near the grave, but later, that cold air followed me. The whispers intensified, and although I couldn't understand what they were saying, it was always the same deep, repetitive voice, stuck in my mind like an unbearable echo. One night, while walking among the graves with my flashlight, I saw him again, closer this time. His face was disfigured with sadness, with streaks of tears running down his cheeks. Upon seeing him, I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching him, and he slowly approached me. When he was close enough, I could see his mouth moving as if trying to speak, but only a cold whisper came out, which turned into a piercing scream that left me paralyzed with terror. Suddenly I felt I could move again, so I ran. I ran without thinking, hurried out of the cemetery, and didn't stop until I got home. I decided I would never return to that cemetery, or any other. But it didn't end there. Now every morning, flowers appear at my doorstep, withered flowers like the ones I saw on the woman's grave. I felt like I could never be safe from that man, not even in my own home. I thought it would be best to move again, to get as far away from that cemetery as possible. Even today, years later, I can still feel his presence, the smell of damp earth, and the echo of his voice. The flowers no longer appear at my door, yet there isn't a single day when I don't hear his footsteps behind me, nor a single night when I don't see his shadow standing at the foot of my bed, staring, always staring. Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.